For just over 4 years, British High Commissioner Harriet Cross has been in Trinidad and Tobago serving as the UK's envoy here. An interesting time to serve, given particular topics including regional security, education and climate change. The latter being quite important, with carbon border adjustment mechanisms kicking in from Europe to the rest of the world very soon, and is set to have an impact on Trinidad and Tobago. As she gets set to take her leave, we sit down with British High Commissioner Harriet Cross to discuss these topics and more. British High Commissioner Harriet Cross, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You are almost ending your commissionership here in Trinidad and Tobago. How would you analyze the relationship, the bilateral relationships between both countries as you take your exit?
Well, we've got a strong bilateral relationship. We've got a strong friendship. And I think we work together on strategic global issues. So whether that's climate change, whether it's regional security, it might be the joint scourge of gender-based violence that is a problem in the UK as much as it is in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's that partnership, solving problems, looking for solutions, that I'd like to think that I've contributed to during my time here.
There have been some challenges while you have been here. I mean, globally, with global impacts to Trinidad
Yes.
and Tobago. What would you say, how would you summarize your tenure here in Trinidad and Tobago?
I'd summarise it as a focus on trade and investment, on working together on security, and actually engaging with non-governmental organisations as well across the piece. So it's from the top level of government to the smallest grassroots NGO. I think I would probably characterise my time as covering that breadth.
Trade relations between both countries and both regions,
Yes.
Europe and here in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
That's a key element, particularly for the economy of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
What state do you leave that in? As there are a number of rising concerns when it comes to Europe, particularly for Trinidad and Tobago being an oil and gas-based nation. Let's just take CBAM, for example. Mm-hmm. How would you say that Trinidad and Tobago's trade relations, is it in a good place, and can it kick on after your tenure?
I think we're doing some really good things together on trade and investment. So a good example, we signed an MOU with the Ministry of Finance and UK Export Finance just a few weeks ago. So this was about engaging on projects that are happening in Trinidad and Tobago. So whether that's infrastructure, whether it's green energy, and looking to see, can the UK bring some of those solutions to the table? So that engagement with the Ministry of Finance was really positive. We also have British businesses visiting Trinidad and Tobago almost every week, and that's something that I take a great deal of interest in. I think it's really important that those one-on-one personal relationships are developed. In terms of our trade figures, we're probably on about £750 million, both imports and exports, in terms of the business that we do together. That's up to this sort of last quarter.
Wow, and that particularly is important for Trinidad and Tobago's economy. I just wonder your thoughts as we move into this green space that you yourself have spoken at length about. It seems to be a passionate topic of yours, climate change and the impact of climate change on both this region and the world. As we move into this greener sphere, how do you see this relationship maturing, evolutionizing, maybe the better word, to meet the demands that Europe is leading with when it comes to the green space?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different ways that we work together in terms of the green future. And one, you mentioned CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so the UK is bringing in particular measures to green the goods that it imports. So we've done some work with Trinidad and Tobago to say, this is coming down the line, this is how it will impact you. And we hope that that will encourage Trinidad and Tobago to I guess, decarbonise some of its manufacturing. So that's one way which we're trying to support Trinidad and Tobago in looking at what's coming ahead. But we've also done some really interesting work on how Trinidad and Tobago can use its natural resources. So we've done some work on mangrove swamps, for example, with UE. How can they carbon capture? But importantly, how can Trinidad and Tobago monetize that carbon capture? You know, because you have to follow the money to a certain extent. It's going to be hard to green if it costs money. It's going to be hard to go green if there's social injustice as part of that. So you need to ensure that it comes with jobs, that it comes with training. And that's something that the UK has undergone itself. So there's an element of learn from what we've done, but learn from our mistakes as well, and hopefully you can avoid some of them.
I mean, you make an excellent point there. For a small island developing state like Trinidad and Tobago, and those across the region, but particularly Trinidad and Tobago, that will be so severely impacted by the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, that is coming soon into the future. The UK and Europe's intervention to help such a SID ensure that, its reliance on exporting to Europe as a revenue earner, that work that the UK and Europe does is going to be very critical to the relationship, maintaining such relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and Europe, or else CBAM could potentially, push Trinidad and Tobago further away from countries like the UK.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we put the mechanism in place to incentivize countries to move down the green path. But it's really important that we support countries to reach the standards that we think are important globally. And we're doing a huge amount ourselves domestically, sometimes quite painful things, to move away from fossil fuels and to make sure that the UK is a leader, and that we're not just saying do this, but we're doing it ourselves as well. Yeah,
another matter of interest between both parties across the Atlantic would be regional security here in the Caribbean. We've seen crime scourge across the region, not just in Trinidad and Tobago. Europe's role in securing the Caribbean, what is Europe's interests and role, particularly the United Kingdom?
So there's an element of making sure that the UK is safe. That's our starting point. But then it's a question of making sure that our partners are also safe. And Trinidad and Tobago is a really good example of a country that actually suffers from challenges that originate elsewhere. Trinidad and Tobago is largely not the originator of a lot of the security challenges in the region. It clearly isn't. They are coming from elsewhere. So how can we work with Trinidad and Tobago to solve what is essentially a joint problem? So one good example of some work that we did together was on asset recovery and management. It's kind of quite techie, but it's about how can you recover money from the criminals. If you take the money away from those criminal networks, they'll find it harder to grow and develop and to do more bad things. But it's actually quite difficult to get money from the criminals once they've been prosecuted. So what do you need for legislation? How do you need to train your law enforcement officers? How do you need to train your judiciary? So we've done some really interesting work on that over a period of months and years, and that was really well received here. And that was a good example of, it's kind of behind the scenes work to a certain extent, but I think it has a big difference in the long term to how Trinidad and Tobago can protect itself.
I want to talk a little bit about education as well between the United Kingdom and Trinidad and Tobago. This isn't just a modern topic that we're talking about. In fact, education between the United Kingdom and Trinidad and Tobago, that has been an historic relationship, because Trinbagonians have historically went to the UK, be it Oxford University, be it Cambridge University, whether it was Dr. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of the country, or V.S. Naipaul, a Nobel laureate, have gone to United Kingdom universities, and that tradition and that history has more or less continued. That has been a priority of your time here, to ensure that more Trinbagonians have access to universities in the United Kingdom.
Yes, that's true. So we've got a Achieving Scholarship scheme that runs every single year. Anybody can apply as long as they've got the ability to do a master's degree in the UK. We've really tried, and something that I'm really proud of is that me and my team have tried to make sure that people who maybe wouldn't think that they would be eligible, so people from different backgrounds, people who
rural communities,
people who don't live in the capital cities, maybe people who think, well, I don't come from a moneyed background, so it's not for me. But actually, it's for anybody who's got the academic ability. So that's been a really exciting development, I would say. But also, we've been engaging with the private sector to see if we can get funding to increase the number of scholarships that we run through private sector companies here. And we've had some real interest. So I would love to think that in 25, 26 and beyond, we'll be able to offer more scholarships as a result of that private-public sector partnership.
Coming up after the break, from English cricket to the English Premier League. Is that avenue of sport, Madam High Commissioner, being explored sufficiently between both countries?
I think we can definitely do more.
getting experience post-graduating. The United Kingdom government has also looked at that for Trinbagonians to spend more time in the United Kingdom post-graduating to get the experience that they would have learned in universities.
Yeah, I mean, Trinbagonians contribute a huge amount to British society, you know, whether it's in the NHS, whether it's in research, whether it's in the cultural sphere, and we really want that, that expertise. But at the same time, you need to be careful that we don't drain expertise from Trinidad and Tobago. So one of the provisions of the Chevening Scholarship is that people have to come back to Trinidad and Tobago for a certain period of years after their study, and I think that's really important too.
Let's talk a little bit about the UK's involvement in the Caribbean, particularly when it comes to the Joint Caribbean Task Force and the CARICOM. How has that intervention helped the region, a region that has become so vulnerable, as you yourself has alluded to?
Yeah, CARICOM is an enormously important organisation. Our High Commissioner, who sits in Guyana, represents the UK in terms of our relationship with CARICOM. But actually UK Impacts, which is the security arm of CARICOM, sits in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have a specific UK-based member of staff, a UK diplomat, who engages with CARICOM Impacts. So we've done some great work. We've done work on small arms and light weapons and destruction of weapons. We've done that with CARICOM Impacts. And we've also done some work on sort of research analysts, because again, intelligence is such an important part of working out what the criminals are doing. And the sharing of intelligence within CARICOM is something that I think is developing, and it's important. So that's another area that we've looked at.
Madam High Commissioner, if the region is to solve this challenge and problem of transnational crime, how big a role will the United Kingdom have to play in this? You've been High Commissioner for a few years now. You've seen the growing trend of, you yourself say geographically, Trinidad and Tobago is in just that spot that is not creating the problem, but the problem is passing through.
Yeah. I think an important element here is about donor coordination, because there are a lot of countries who sit in Trinidad and Tobago who want to contribute to tackling the security problem. The US is a really good example. They play a huge role. So the question is, where does the UK fit into that? We don't want to duplicate what the US is doing, because then that creates work for your civil servants. Oh, there's the UK again trying to give us some money to do something. We don't have the capacity to respond. So I think that donor relationship is where you start to work out who should contribute in which ways. Some of the ways that we've looked at, cybersecurity is a really good example, that this is a kind of new area for all of us. But Trinidad and Tobago has seen some cyber attacks, some really serious cyber attacks in the last year or so. So has the UK. What have we done to protect ourselves? So firstly, you need to do a survey. Where are our weak points in terms of where cyber attacks could happen? Again, it's not particularly exciting work, it's behind the scenes work, but that's one area where the UK thinks it can contribute. Another one is women in leadership. It's something that, again, is really important to me. We've run some training about female leadership in security in Trinidad and Tobago. You've got some excellent examples of female leadership in your security services and your ministries. But how do women, particularly at the middle level, how do they get to those senior leadership roles? How do they contribute to the work that we're talking about? And again, it's something that's really important to the UK. And so that's another area where we feel we can contribute to this fight.
I want to go back to that point you made about cybersecurity, because we are now very much in that age, in that threat, and it continues to rear its face ever so often on a massive scale. And that, Madam High Commissioner, is key to your point. That is not something that Trinidad and Tobago can solve on its own. That's not something that the United Kingdom can solve on its own. That requires multilateral meetings at a global level. In a world that is becoming, we're seeing the far-right nationalism spread across the globe. I mean, these threats of cybersecurity to be met by a global consensus of governments, do you fear that we might be isolating the problem?
I think the multilateral system actually works very well. And I think sometimes the criminals and some of the rogue states that are supporting those criminals would like to divide the multilateral system. And Trinidad and Tobago and the UK's conversations that we have about multilateral meetings, I've literally had conversations about cybersecurity in the multilateral space with Dr. Amory Brown. I do think that's certainly one flank of the fight, but another one is the private sector as well. We have to get the private sector involved in this challenge. You know, whether it's digital companies, whether it's supermarkets or whatever it might be, everybody needs to protect themselves, and that's where the private sector comes in. So it's a partnership. We can't do it alone. I don't think we're being isolated. I think we're very much trying to create that joint sense of this is a challenge that we all face. How can we work together?
I do want to bring up another topic, something that you're also very passionate about: sport.
Yes.
Sport in Trinidad and Tobago and sport in the United Kingdom connect on many levels, not just cricket. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, the English Premier League is perhaps the most famous football league when it comes to supportership. A lot of people are Manchester United fans, Liverpool fans, Manchester City fans, Arsenal fans, what have you. On a purely sporting level, there are so many opportunities between the UK and Trinidad and Tobago, and it goes just beyond cricket, which has obviously enjoyed an enormous support down the years, with so many Trinidad and Tobago cricketers playing in county cricket clubs across in the United Kingdom. But that's also, is that avenue of sport, Madam High Commissioner, being explored sufficiently between both countries?
I think we can definitely do more. You know, there's a theme of sports diplomacy, and it's a real thing. You know, it's an important part of our bigger relationship. And I'm ashamed to say this, I learned about cricket in Trinidad and Tobago.
No, you
taught me.
Are you even British?
Yeah, exactly. You taught me what I needed to know about cricket, and I've really enjoyed the conversations that I've had at the Oval, etc. We've done some great work on the Commonwealth and sports. We did a Commonwealth Youth Sports Day. You hosted the Commonwealth Youth Games, which I had fabulous time. I mean, that's where you teach young kids about discipline, about losing, about holding your emotions in, and about being a winner, and about coming second. You know, these are really important. Sport teaches you so much about democracy, actually. We've done some really good work in rugby and schools. You know, schools that don't have very much, we've taken them equipment and we've said, get your kids on a rugby field. So I'd love to think there's more we could do with that, particularly, as I say, with Commonwealth partners. We've got India here, you know, we've got all sorts of Australia. You know, these are countries that are in the same space as the UK and Trinidad and Tobago when it comes to the love of sport. So I think there's a lot more we can do together.
Coming up after the break, final thoughts from the British High Commissioner on her time in TNT.
And I think you have to be authentic. I think that is one of the things that if you can be a successful ambassador or leader in any sphere, if you can be as authentic as possible, people feel that.
And of course, there was a Commonwealth Sports Day hosted by the British High Commission.
There was, yes.
Yeah. I was on the winning team, Team India, hosting. But Madam High Commissioner, as you come to your end here and you look at the state of the Caribbean, you've had the opportunity to live here for a few years. What do you make of the evolution of the Caribbean as a society?
As a society, you are one of the warmest, most embracing cultures I've ever met, and I think that is a real strength. You are a proud people, the Caribbean, and I think that's incredibly important because there are a lot of blows coming your way. For example, in terms of climate change, you know, that's really tough stuff. And again, that's where the international community has to step in to make sure that we can provide the support to mitigate some of those blows. I think on the green climate agenda, I think progress is being made. I've been really impressed to see some of the experimentation that's being done here on wind energy, for example. The solar farms are finally pretty much up and running now. I see it when I go into the airport. I see the amount of solar energy. But again, I think that's something that in terms of economic diversification that Trinidad and Tobago talks about, I'd love to see more of that happening. And it's on the brink. And I think that's really exciting.
At COP29, interestingly, we just saw collapse talks eventually leading to an underwhelming, what small island developing states deem an underwhelming outcome at COP29. I was actually making, on a personal level, I was actually making the point to someone at COP that it might be difficult for some people who originate from big cities like London, like New York, like Riyadh, to understand what small island developing states go through, because they just don't have that capacity, because they're from a big city, and the resources are there. You've lived now in a small island developing state, and you've seen the challenges. I just wonder, your advice to world leaders and to fellow ambassadors who may not have had the opportunity to live through a small island developing state, life in a small island developing state.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the vulnerability. I live in Marival, and I've seen the floods come through Marival, and the damage that causes, and the worry that it causes, and the long-term impact. I would agree with you that I think many parts of COP29 were really disappointing, particularly on the mitigation side that we're talking about now. But I think there were some wins, I think, on finance and on carbon markets. And I think we have to hold on to those wins and use them as a foundation, because we have to deal with this. We have to now work to COP30 in Brazil. And I think we've got enough wins out of COP29 to be able to do that. But the UK is only emits 1% of global emissions. So in many ways, we understand that as a very low emitter, it's frustrating to see higher emitters not coming up with the goods. That I also, from a TNT perspective, I think the UK has similar feelings. We've also seen huge floods in Wales in the last few days. It's scary, and that's why we have to get the mitigation part right. We have to lower the, I guess, just global warming, essentially.
I want to talk a little bit about your time here, Madam High Commissioner. You made yourself present for the public of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly social media. I remember when you had just gotten here as High Commissioner, you got onto X, you were connecting with a lot of Trinbagonians. Trinbagonians were following you, you were following back. You really made it a priority to engross yourself with the public of this country.
Yes, I do. And I think you have to be authentic. I think that is one of the things that if you can be a successful ambassador or leader in any sphere, if you can be as authentic as possible, people feel that. And I wasn't just going on Twitter to think, how can I polish my social media brand? I was going on there because that's where a lot of people have interesting conversations. And funnily enough, some of the friends that I will take away when I leave Trinidad and Tobago, I found them first on social media. I think that's really, really nice. But I think that's the other thing about being an ambassador. Sometimes you can move in these little bubbles where you only speak to other ambassadors or you only speak to ministers. And I think that's a real loss, because if you're speaking to somebody who lives outside of San Fernando and you've met them at a panyard, you get a completely different perspective on Trinidad and Tobago. And that I've also really loved doing that.
What's been the highlight of your career here?
The highlight of my career, honestly, it's the engagement with the people. That is absolutely the highlight. It's being able to walk in the forests with somebody that I'd never met before, telling me about howler monkeys, and going to Desperados and somebody telling me about the origin of the particular soca song that I'm listening to, which is now being played on the pan. Incredible.
What would you miss the most?
Oh my gosh. Probably the sounds of the birds in the trees, because that soundtrack. I was in the UK about a week ago, and my husband called me, and I said, "What is that sound in the background?" It was the parrots, and when you hear them on the telephone, it sounds really strange. And when you're in the UK, you almost immediately lose that oral sort of soundscape that exists in Trinidad and Tobago. It's really special.
You bow out of Trinidad and Tobago, Madam High Commissioner, at an interesting time in geopolitics. I mean, I myself mentioned it to you about the rise of the far right across several parts of the world. We see the war in Ukraine. We see what is happening in the Middle East, the unending violence in the Middle East. I just wonder your thoughts on how, and your message, your lasting message to the people of Trinidad and Tobago as you depart, but also to your followers, of whom you've found so many friends.
I think in terms of global challenges, it's moderate, sensible democracies like the UK, like Trinidad and Tobago, like many countries in this region. We need to stick together and we need to look for solutions together. I think that's really important. In terms of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, I guess I want to say thank you for embracing me so warmly and for teaching me so much, not just about cricket, but about life, I suppose. I've really developed during my time here. You know, you never stop learning, and this has been a classroom for me for 4 years, so thank you so much.
Outgoing British High Commissioner Harriet Cross, thank you very much for your service to our country, and thank you very much for coming onto the programme.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to have talked to you today.